Today's daf we're going to be learning is Beitzah Yud Daled. Today's daf is dedicated in honor of my brother, John Cohen, who started the daf in Masechet Nida at the end of the last cycle and has kept it up since. Happy birthday. Okay, we are going to start at the bottom of Yud Gimel Amud Bet. What we're dealing with, all of these topics, are topics of how to do certain melachot on Yom Tov, right? So we know that Ochal Nefesh, things for Ochal Nefesh purposes are permitted. We had all these discussions in Machlokot between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Once we permit it for Ochal Nefesh, we permit it for other things, right? Transferring a fire or carrying or things like that. Then we talked about this mililot. And in the end, we said, well, you could do it, but a little bit different than you normally do it, right? Not in a way that looks like you're doing it, for a regular day, right? There's always this concern. Again, some of the issues that come up are concerns that maybe it doesn't relate to Ochal Nefesh, or it's not for today, or, that you're doing too much, or it looks like something you might do on a regular day. And we have to always be kind of playing with these issues. On the one hand, we want to allow it. On the other hand, we also don't want you to get into a situation where you push things off to Yantif and do them on Yantif when you could have done them yesterday, right? So there's all these issues at play, and we're going to see all of those factors in today's daf when it comes to all sorts of different melachot on Shabbat, or relating to melachot of Shabbat. Are they permitted on Yantif, and if so, how? So now we're up to the minapach. After you do this mililot, where you basically crush the grain, the stalks in order to get the grains out. Now you're stuck with a pile of the chaff and the wheat, or whatever it is that you're molel, right? You have the grain, the kernel, and you have the husks. So how do you get rid of the husks? So you blow them, minapach, right? You blow them and they fly away. So ketzad minapach, with the bottom of your Gimel Amud Bet, how do you do this? In other words, again, the assumption is you have to do it a little differently than normal. So the normal way you would do it is you would take two hands, you would put your hands together, put everything in your hands and go, a big blow, and everything will blow away. So Amarav, if you remember, we already learned that how do you do it? You do it in one hand only. Question is, how do you do it in one hand? So Rav Adbar Abba says in the name of Rav, minapech mikishrei etzba'otav l'mala. You use your fingertips. You put it on your fingertips, not in the palm of your hand, which would be the normal way. Put it on your fingertips and blow. They laughed at him in Eretz Yisrael. They said, what a ridiculous thing he just said. We don't need two changes. We already said you can't do it in two hands. So once you can do it in one hand, you can use the palm of your hand. Why are you insisting on doing it on your fingertips? Ela Amar Rabbi Elazar, so Rabbi Elazar, who was from Israel, said otherwise, minapech biyado achat ubechol kocho. You can blow by putting it in one hand, meaning you can use the palm of your hand and you can blow with all of your energy. In other words, you don't have to do it lightly or something and say, I need to change my level of energy. No, you're allowed to do it a totally normal way. As long as you don't use two hands, you're using one hand, that's enough of a change for it to be an indication that you understand that we're just doing it for Yantif. Again, there's always a concern, if we allow you to do it the normal way, you might come to just do more. Like you'll be doing it the way you usually do it every day. And on a regular day, you might do extra, not just for today. So we do it with a change. New Mishnah, new topic, but again, similar idea. Beit Shammai omrim, tavlin nidochim b'madoch shel etz, v'hamelach b'pach u'be'etz ha'paror. If you remember, okay, now we're talking about crushing things in a mortar and pestle. Now the question is, if you remember, we talked about before that the Eli was a muktzah item. Remember, it's a klisha v'lachtol isur even on Yantif. So how could that be if we allow grinding in some kind of way? So the assumption is that the Eli was used for grains, and that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about, we're going to see the grains you can't do for sure in a big mortar and pestle. So right here we're talking about a mortar and pestle that's specifically designed for spices. Okay, whereas again, grains we're going to see is different. Now we're going to talk about spices and salt. And we're going to see that the Mishnah differentiates between both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, differentiate between spices and salt. And we're going to have to see in the Gemara why this is. So Beit Shammai says, spices, instead of normally you would use one that was stone. Instead of using one of stone, you can use one that's made of wood. Okay, so you can use a mortar and pestle made of wood, but not stone. So that's your shinoi. The hamelach, if you use salt and you want to grind the salt, bepach ube'etz ha'paror. Okay, the way they explain it in the Koran is not using both, but one or the other. Okay, so either you can use an earthenware jug, and what do? Right, you take the jug and you smash it onto the salt, crush it in that way. That's clear shinoi, right? That's a lot different than just saying, I'm not going to use a stone mortar and pestle, I'm going to use a wooden one. This is something entirely different, right? This is using some other utensil. Or eitza parol, which is a spoon, like a wooden spoon. You crush it using the spoon. He says, when it comes to spices, you don't need any sort of change. But the salt, the salt you have to change. Don't do it in one of stone. Use one that's made of wood. Okay, but you can use a mortar and pestle. You just can't use one of stone. You change it to wood. So he's obviously much more lenient, which fits Beit Hillel in general in all these cases, other than our first Mishnah. So the Gemara says, let's first understand. Everyone agrees. Let's talk about what everyone agrees about. Everyone agrees, mihat melach by shinoi. Salt clearly needs some sort of change, right? Beit Hillel said the spices don't need anything. Beit Shammai says the spices also do, and they disagree a bit about which kind of change the salt needs, but they all agree that salt needs some sort of shinoi, change. My taima, what's the reason? So Rav Huna and Rav Chisda, they have a machloket about it. We don't know who says what, but each of them gives a different reason. Chadamal, kol hakterot kulan tzrichot melach, ve'ein kol hakterot tzrichot tavlin. I'll already preface this by saying that today is all about things in the kitchen, and you're going to relate to a lot of the things they say from practical, things we know from the kitchen. So, right, who here puts salt in everything they make, right? Something common that generally, you might use cumin in something, and you might use garlic in something, and you might, right? Some people use, in my house, garlic is used probably almost as much as salt, but right, salt is used in everything. So because salt is used in everything, so what does that have to do with anything? Well, it has everything to do with it, because if salt is always used, then before Yantif starts, okay, now this I have to already say, this is a little different than our reality. Okay, let me actually first preface by what we do. Right, nowadays, even if you're the kind of person who does cook on Yantif, you usually have a menu and you know exactly what you're making. I mean, maybe not, maybe I'm kind of using my own example, but maybe there are people who kind of just wing it on Yantif. But I would assume that most people, especially since we can't go to the store and go buy things, right? In those days, remember, they were able to go to the store. So people generally know what it is they're going to make, and they make sure they have all the ingredients in the house, before Yantif. But here we're talking about a situation where they didn't know necessarily what they were going to cook. So comes Yantif and they say, okay, let's take what I've got. And they might decide they're going to make a particular dish and they need a particular spice for it. Now, since you don't know what spices, you don't know what you're going to make before Yantif, and you don't know what spices you're going to need. So therefore, we allow you to crush it on Yantif because you didn't know from yesterday. The whole idea is if you could do it yesterday, remember I said there's different factors at play. One of the factors is if you could have done it yesterday, you should have done it yesterday. So salt, since you put salt in everything, therefore, you definitely needed to grind your salt from before Yantif because you knew you were going to need it. Whereas your cumin or your saffron or whatever it might be, you might not have known that you were going to make this recipe that required them, in which case you didn't necessarily have to do it from yesterday, in which case we'll allow you to do it today. And that's why we distinguish between salt and other spices. The chadamar, the other option is to say, kol tavlin mifigin ta'aman, umelach ein mifigat ta'ama. Spices, right? And people even say salt is not a spice, it's different. Salt, what's one of the main differences? Salt, its taste doesn't change once you grind it. It doesn't get less potent. Whereas spices will lose some of their strong flavors if you crush them the day before. Therefore, even though you could have done it from yesterday, however, it would decrease the flavor that it would give. And therefore, again, for the purposes of Simchat Yom Tov, this is the same reason why we allow you to slaughter today. We allow you to bake your bread today. You could have baked the bread yesterday, but it's not as fresh. So you want to have the freshest food, the most tasty food. We allow you, therefore, to do the spices on Yantif. Again, whether you're Beit Shammai, you allow it with a small change, not as much of a major change. And if you're Beit Hillel, you permit it entirely the regular way. And that's because of one of these two reasons. To which the Gemara asks, my benayu. So what's the difference between them, right? Because what's the nafkamina, as we like to say? Where would there be a practical difference? What kind of situation? So they're going to give two reasons. Each one is going to be relating to each of the answers. If you planned everything before and you knew you were going to make that on Yantif, like most of us do nowadays, then you should have made sure to crush that spice before Yantif. But if that's only if you say that the issue is that melach goes into everything and spices not necessarily, but if you say it's all about the flavor, then it wouldn't matter and you'd still be allowed to do it today. Inami b'morika, or it could be saffron. What's the difference with saffron? Saffron is like salt in that it doesn't lose its taste. If you crush it yesterday, it'll be the same today. So therefore, if you say it's about the flavor, then you're going to say the saffron would have to be done from yesterday because it's no different and you don't gain by doing it on Yantif. Whereas if you say the reason is about planning your meal and you had no idea what you were making, then it wouldn't be relevant whether it's saffron or whether it's some other spice. Now we're going to see. So until now, we have this machloket, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai says do a small change for the spice, major change for the salt. Beit Hillel says only for the salt, you don't need to make any change for this, and smaller change than Beit Shammai needed for the salt. But now, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda paskins in the name of Shmuel. Kol hanidochim nidochin kedarkan fa'afilu melach. Wow, this is strange. All spices can be crushed in their normal manner, even salt. Now that goes against Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. How could that be? So that's what the Gemara says. V'ha'amart melach ba'is shinoi. But didn't we say that everyone agrees that salt needs some sort of change? So Huda Amar ki haitana. He must hold like a different Tana. We're going to see Rabbi Meir, as we saw before, it was usually Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, had a different tradition about what the machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel is. Now we're going to see that Rabbi Meir had a different tradition, and in fact, Shmuel held by that tradition. So let's see the difference in the machloket. Ditanya, Amar Rabbi Meir, Lo nechleku Beit Shammai uBeit Hillel al hanidochin shenidochin kedarkan umelach imahen. Beit Shammai Beit Hillel do not have a disagreement about spices, nidochin, or spices that are normally ground, that are ground in their normal manner. And melach imahen, what does that mean? That means if I'm grinding spices and I put the salt in the mortar with everything else together, I can grind the salt together with other things. Okay, so in that case, salt together mixed with other things can be ground. However, the whole question is, can you do salt on its own? So, Beit Shammai Omrim, now we're going to see, okay, that's number one difference, okay, that according to the first opinion, salt, according to everyone, salt can be ground together with the other spices. That didn't come up at all in our mission. The second difference is going to be, when we talk about salt on its own, what exactly is different? And by the way, no one disagrees about spices at all. According to our Mishnah, Beit Shammai said even spices have to be in the wooden and not the stone. But here they say no, Beit Shammai thinks those can be ground normally. And here's another difference. When it comes to salt, Beit Shammai Omrim, melach bepachu be'etza paror. Okay, that at least matches what Beit Shammai said in our Mishnah about the salt. But here he adds not only with what can it be used, with what utensil can you grind it with. He also discussed about for what purpose you can grind it with. He limited, not for all purposes. Litzli avalo l'kdera. You can do it for roasted items, but not for a pot cooked with food. What's the difference? So there's a bunch of different explanations given. We'll go with Rashi. Rashi says the difference is that when you put salt on a roasted item, I guess roasted items have a lot of flavor because they're roasted. So you put less salt on it. But when you put it in a kdera, in a pot, you add a lot of salt. So it's an issue of quantity. Okay, you want larger quantity for the kdera. We don't allow such a large quantity, even if you need it for yantif. Beit Shammai is not going to allow that. Another opinion, I'll just quote you another one. For example, another one given is that for roasted, you need coarse salt, so you grind it less. Whereas for a kdera, you usually use more fine salt. So because of that, it's a matter of how long you need to grind it for and how small you need to grind it. So those are two possibilities, but the main important thing here is that Beit Shammai, according to Rabbi Meir, not only limits, right? So in a sense, Beit Shammai is more lenient here because he doesn't relate to the spices at all. The spices are totally fine, and he allows salt mixed together with other spices. However, when it comes to the salt, he limits it not only in what utensils, what implements you can use, but also for what purpose you can grind the salt for. Ubeit Hillel omrim b'chol davar. Beit Hillel says with everything. To which the Gemara asks, now, which issue is he referring to? Is he referring to which utensil, which it sounds like? B'chol davar is with any utensil, it sounds like. And lichol davar would be the second part of Beit Shammai, which is for the purposes of roasting or cooking in a pot. So first he says bichol davar. It sounds like you can use anything you want to grind it up. To which the Gemara says bichol davar sal kadatach. And Rashi explains what's the Gemara's question. Bichol davar sounds like you can use anything you want in the world. Meaning, I'll give you an example. Let's say you could take a stone and crush it with a stone. Now, what's the problem with crushing it with a stone? Or the Gemara thinks there's no way he could be saying that because its stone is muktzah. Remember, we always say stones are muktzah, right? We're not talking about a mortar and pestle that was made of stone. We're talking about an actual stone, right? An actual stone is totally muktzah. You can't just use anything to crush this with and say, oh, well, because I'm allowed to crush it on Yantif, I can even take a stone. Can't be Beit Hillel saying that. So they say, instead of saying bichol davar, you should say, read it as for any purpose. In other words, whether it's for a pot, whether it's for roasting meat, whatever it's for, you can do it. We don't care how much you need. As long as you need it for Yantif, no problem. So again, according to this, Beit Hillel requires no shinoi whatsoever when it comes to salt, because they say you can do it any way you want. Again, that would mean using a utensil, not using a utensil, but yes, using a utensil. You don't have to change from the normal way you do it. And therefore, that's why Shmuel paskined that it was fine to do this. Even melach can be crushed in its normal way based on Beit Hillel, according to Rabbi Meir's interpretation. So again, I'm just going to review this because it's interesting to see this connection between all our sugiyot. First of all, everything we've learned so far, there's been machlokot Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. Today, we're going to finally get to something where it seems maybe, we'll talk about it, maybe it's not a machloket and they both agree, but one of the topics. But in general, we've seen machlokot Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, and oftentimes we've seen different traditions about what exactly the machloket was, and that's because right and it's all Tanaitic debates about what Beit Shammai Beit Hillel did, and that's because Beit Shammai Beit Hillel were earlier in the earlier part of the Tkufat Tanaim, the time period of the Tanaim. And what happened is over the generations, even within the Tanaitic time period, there were different traditions that developed as to how to understand what the machloket was. Because again, this was all passed down orally. And when things are passed down orally, it leads to mistakes, which is why they eventually decided we need to write this down. Continuing on, another case. Amar le Rav Acha bar Dila leberei, ki dayachta atzle atzluye v'dof. When you're going to grind, and Rashi says we're talking about salt, when you're going to grind your salt, do it with a change, okay? In other words, yes, you could do it according to Beit Hillel, we said, with a regular grinder, but turn it on its side, okay? And do it in a bit of a different way than you normally do it, okay? And then, so in other words, we need a minor change, right? If you change between, Beit Shammai, it said madoch shel pach or eitza parur or something totally different, whereas Beit Hillel in our Mishnah had said, no, you just have to change which type of mortar and pestle you use, has to be wood. And then we get to Rabbi Meir, who thinks that they don't even need it to be in a different utensil. You could use the regular one, but still you should do some sort of change with that regular one. Turn it on its side. Rav Sheshet. Okay, now the first thing you need to know about Rav Sheshet is he was blind. It's very important for the story because you're going to see that he had a very keen sense of sense of hearing. His hearing is going to play a very big factor. We're going to compare this later. There's going to be a story where someone's vision, and what he saw played an important role here. Because Rav Sheshet was blind, it's going to be his hearing that plays an important factor in the story. Rav Sheshet Shama, he heard. Now you can see why this was important because he was blind, he couldn't see. But he hears kal buchna. He hears the sound of a mortar and pestle grinding on yantif. Amal, hi lav migave de beitahu. This is clearly not coming from my house because no one in my house would be grinding salt. Vidilma atzluya atzle. Maybe they were doing it on its side. In other words, the assumption is you would have to do it with a shinoi, like we said a minute ago. And it would have to be on its side. And he's saying no one would grind it normally in my house. They're saying maybe what he heard was the grinding on its side. And then maybe they took the mortar and pestle, they turned it outside and they were grinding it that way. So why that wouldn't be a problem. So they say, Deshame dehave tzlil kaleh. He heard that it was a very clear sound. And because it was a very clear sound, Adina, wait with your question, you're going to see. Because it was a very clear sound, he knew that it wasn't on its side. Okay, again, this is this is something I don't think, even if I normally ground this stuff, I would be able to be sensitive to the difference in the sound. But Rav Sheshet, who was blind, who had a very probably well-developed sense of sound, of hearing, he obviously understood this difference. Vidilma tavlin havu. Now, how do you know it was salt? Maybe it was a spice, which could be done normally without any sort of change. Tavlin mibuche menabech kalayu. Again, the sound of grinding, of crushing spices. I think the assumption is the spices were usually maybe seeds and they had to, really crack them. It was kind of a much louder sound. It sounded like a dog barking, like a barking kind of sound. That's not the sound that he heard. Again, you could tell the difference between the sound. Maybe that's a sound I'd be able to distinguish, but that's a sound that he was able to know. And therefore it was clear to him that they were doing it normally and that it was salt. And therefore he said, this clearly isn't coming from my house. And I guess he was trying to tell people, this is not allowed. It's an interesting way of, if you want to sort of tell someone, don't do this, it's an interesting way to say it. In my house, we don't do this, and it's sort of a little bit not attacking, but sort of attacking, but in maybe a nicer kind of way, saying, or maybe one would say, maybe that's insulting and saying, oh, in my house, we wouldn't do this. And I can't believe you're doing it. So it's an interesting way to figure out whether he was doing it in a nice way or not a nice way. Really what his point was he just trying to make a comment, or was probably he was trying to teach other people, oh, we don't do this. And again, the fact that he was blind obviously affects how the story came about. Number one, because he could hear so well, and distinguish sounds much better than maybe the average person. And also because he was all going by sound. If he was able to see, this wouldn't even be an issue. He would have seen if it was someone in his house or not someone in his house. Tanu Rabbanan. Another thing. Now we're going to move away from spices and salt, and we're going to move into grinding up grains. And this is what I said before. The eli was used for grinding grains, or a machteshet. And we're going to see what's allowed to be done, what's not allowed to be done. So we start off with a Beitzah. Ein osim tisni. Can't prepare tisni. It was some sort of dish that they would grind up the grains very, very, very well. Okay, as opposed to we're going to see like a porridge, which is somewhat ground, but not fully ground. So you can't make this kind of dish. Ve'en kochim b'machteshet. And you can't use the machteshet, which was the normal mortar and pestle, for crushing the grains. You can't use that. So now the Gemara says, tarte, wait, this is very strange. It sounds like you're saying you don't seem tisni, but you could grind something else. And presumably, where would you grind something else? You grind it in the machteshet. So something doesn't really jive here. So they say hachikama. The way you should read it is like this. Matan ein osim tisni. What's the reason why you can't grind tisni? Lefi she'ein kochim b'machteshet. Because you can't crush things in this machteshet, therefore you can't crush and prepare the tisni. V'lema ein kochim b'machteshet. But if really what you were trying to say in the end is you can't use the machteshet, you should have just said you can't use the machteshet. It's a little bit misleading, because if it says don't make tisni and don't use machteshet, it almost sounds like maybe just you can't use the machteshet for tisni. But they seem to be saying, no, you can't use the machteshet at all for anything. So it seems weird that they would add this tisni in. So what do they answer? Itane en kochim b'machteshet hava amina hanimili b'machteshet gdola. If it had just said don't use a machteshet, you might have thought only a large machteshet you can't use. Maybe because you don't normally use a small one. Therefore, you might have thought a small one maybe is permitted, again, using a shinoi, just like with the salt and the spices. Ema shapir dami, you might have thought you can do it. Kamash malan. By saying enosim tisni, and by saying en koshim machteshet, it must be teaching something additional. What's it saying? Tisni, you can't even prepare in a small machteshet. Okay? You can't even use a small one. Okay, or the truth is, it's really saying you can't use tisni, which comes to add as enkochiv machteshet. You can't make tisni, and you can't even use a machteshet ktana. In other words, it's trying to tell you two things, which is not only can't you do it, but you also can't do it with a small one, and you can't do anything with a small one or a large one. It's basically teaching about everything, but it's using tisni to kind of say we're teaching you something additional. What's the additional thing? Don't think kochim machteshet is just large, even a small one. We're going to reject this answer. It's not the greatest answer, and we're going to reject it right now based on another Beitzah. V'hatanya, ein kochim machtesha gedola, aval kochim machtesha ketana. Here it says you actually can crush things in a small one because that's, again, a change. What's also the problem? In a big one, it either looks like you're doing something that's for a regular day because you're doing more, right, which we've seen before, or it's that you're doing, maybe it's more of an uvda dechol, it's like a weekday activity. It's not, the way we say things are not in the spirit of Shabbat, maybe it's not in the spirit of Yom Tov to use a large one, but you can use a small one. So what does Abaye say? Abaye says, Kitanya nami matnita machtesha kedolatanya. So now let's look in Rashi to understand what he means. What he's saying is in the Beitzah, the first Beitzah, it was also talking about a gedolah. So let's read Rashi, explains it very well. 4 lines from the bottom. Kitanya manita dilael, the first Beitzah that said, not in the, right, you can't do the tisni and you can't use a machtesha gedolah. And you can't do a machteshet, period. It didn't say large or small. We're now going to reject the first explanation, and Abaye is going to say this is how we should read it. Machteshet gedolah tanya. V'lo tema mata'am kamar. Don't explain why can't you do the tisni because one can't use a machteshet at all. No, ela tarte ketani. It's really telling you 2 things. What it's telling you is, number 1, ein osim tisni klal, even in a small one. And then ein kochim machteshet, only a large one. Meaning, tisni is unique, right? Before we tried to say they're adding tisni just to tell you 2 different things. 1, you can't use a machteshet at all, and 2, you can't use it even in a small one. Now we're saying, no, you actually could use a small one. Only with a tisni, you can't use a small one. So when it says, ein osim tisni, it means even in a small machteshet, even in a small mortar and pestle. But ein kochim machteshet, we're talking about everything else, that's only in a large one. But everything else is permitted in a small one. Again, that's because what we said is you're crushing it less. It's not as much work as the other one. Okay, so therefore, that's what we need. Tanya. Now we're going to bring a Beitzah. No, what did I? Oh, sorry. That's machtesha gedolah Tanya. That was probably the last sentence. Right? The Beitzah was referring to the machtesha gedolah. Rava gives a different reason. Okay, so is a favorite reason. Lo kasha halan halahu. This is for them. Oh, sorry. This is for lan lanu, and this is for them. Who's us? Rava's living in Babylonia. This is for us, the Babylonians, and that's for them, the ones in Israel. Okay, which is which, and what's what, and what's the difference? So this is always interesting because you get to learn a little bit about sociological things that went on and differences between Babel and Eretz Israel. So Rava comes and says, now, what's the difference? It's always interesting because, why is it interesting? Generally, this is said in the Gemara very simply, as if it's obvious. Number 1, it's obvious which goes to which, because we don't even know, right? It says this is this and this is for that. We don't know which is which. And often you have this, you have difference of opinion about which one goes to which country. Number 2, you don't know why it's different. So when they said it, it was totally obvious to them. They didn't even need to explain because everyone knew the differences because they were living through them. Obviously us, and not only us, but Rashi and all the other commentaries who were living hundreds of years later also didn't really understand the culture and what was going on and what the differences between Babylonia and Israel were at the time. So it's all conjecture as to what the differences are. So Rashi says, what's the difference? Halan delatlan avde de mizalzale. We're not as wealthy. Therefore, we don't have servants. And if we don't have servants in Babylonia, what's the issue? This is right, very interesting. If you do things yourself in the kitchen, you know exactly what you're doing and you know how to do things right and you know what's what and no one's going to trick you at all. But if you have a lot of servants working for you, it's very hard to be on top of them all the time, right? This is like kashrut and, with hashgachas. And yes, the mashgiach can come in and check periodically, but he's not there all the time. He doesn't know what everybody's doing all the time. And therefore, there's more reason for concern that someone might be a little bit deceptive here and there. So therefore, they say, Halihu. So let's start with Eretz Israel, and then we'll go back and explain Babylonia because it's going to be more clear. So Rashi says, Di'ile avde de mizalzale. So if we allow in a machteshet ktana, what will happen? They might crush it. Now, then we know you can crush because you can crush in a big one, you could crush in a small one. And the assumption is because they have avde de mizalzale, they have servants who are not so careful. Osim bigdola v'omrim b'ktana asinu. It's much easier for them to do it in the big one. So they'll do it in the big one and they'll claim we did it in the small one. And then you have a problem. And that's why we don't even allow it in a machteshet ktana. So that was the source, right? In other words, again, we have the Beitzah that said, you can use a small one. That one must be for the Babylonians because they know what they're doing because they're the ones in the kitchen. So you tell them, you can't use the small one, you can't use the large one, you can only use the small one, and I'll know in my house, that's what I'll do. But for the ones in Eretz Israel, we say, is for the ones in Israel, because that's to tell you, you can't, and that's going back to our first explanation, which is it's coming to tell you two things to say, if we just said machteshet, you would have thought only a large one, not a small one. Meaning only a large one's forbidden. You can use a small one. Therefore, it says in Otim Tismi to add that even in a small one, you can't do any of them, even in a small one. As opposed to Abaye, who was saying only the Tisni can't be done in a small one, but everything else can be. This explanation is saying nothing can be done even in a small one because we're worried about the servants. Okay, Vidilma. Now the Gemara says, Rav Papi ikle lebei Mar Shmuel. Now we have an interesting story. Rav Papi shows up in Shmuel's house. Now, Mar Shmuel, right? Shmuel is Shmuel. Okay, big Talmid Chacham, we know him. Okay, the story becomes a little bit difficult to understand. Papi shows up at his house. They bring him porridge and he won't eat it. Now remember, porridge is the one that we said is, right, if we hold only tisni can't be done in the large one, but in a small one, but the daisa can be. So they say, according to what we just said, you could do the daisa in a machteshet ktana. Again, it depends what reading you go by, but let's assume you can do it in a small one. And therefore, what's the problem? So they say, he saw that it was really, really well ground. Okay, this is what I said. This is the opposite story of the hearing. Here, it's the seeing. He looked at it. He says, I can tell by what this looks like. Somebody ground this really well. You couldn't do this in a machteshet ktana. Remember, this is Shmuel's house, so it's hard to understand. But wait, it could be they crushed it up yesterday. How do you know they did it today? So again, he saw that the husks were very bright, which means, right, you know what happens after you crush them over the course of a day, they sit around, they get darker, they don't look as white. He saw that they were really white and clean, and he said, must be they just did it now. So those are two possible explanations. But again, those explanations are very difficult to think of. Then how did this happen? Now, Shmuel, right? How did this happen in Shmuel's house? So the second option is to say, Ibait Ema, that wasn't the issue. It wasn't based on what he saw. But he was perceptive in that he knew, Shane Be'mar Shmuel Di'ika Pritzuta Da'avde. He knew he had a lot of servants. And therefore, even though it could be they did a machteshet ktana, he didn't trust the servants. And he didn't trust that they were going to do things right. And therefore, he wouldn't eat, right? What you don't see in the story is what was Shmuel's response to the fact that Rav Papi wouldn't eat his porridge, right? We all know how those things can go sour pretty quickly and people get very insulted and what, you don't trust my kashrus and how could this be? It's interesting that they don't tell us that part of the story. Okay, next Mishnah, new topic, similar though, borer kitniot. You now want to separate the good from the bad, right? The grains the legumes from the chaff, okay, like their peels, etc. Haborer kitniot b'yom tov, again, machloka Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, but here we're going to have a third one. Rabban Gamliel later on is going to chime in and say something else. Beit Shammai omrim, borer ochel v'ochel, you can take out only the good from the bad and eat it immediately. This sounds like what we allow on Shabbat, right? You can also take out good from bad and do it immediately. Beit Hillel omrim, borer kedarko, b'cheiko, b'kanon, u'b'tamchui, aval lo b'tavla, v'lo b'nafa, v'lo b'kvara. You can sift things in your lap, okay, in a kanon, which was like a funnel-like thing, where you put it in this wide funnel, it would be narrow at the bottom, and only the grains would go through, or whatever the kernels, and you'd be left with the husks at the top. Ubetamchoi. Tamchoi we had from Psachim, if you remember, that tamchoi is where people get money, right? Food, like the soup kitchen. But tamchoi was really the dish in which they serve people. It's like a big dish where you could apparently use it also for sifting. But it wasn't specially used for sifting, and that's why you can use it. But not in something that was both large, which meant that you were going to maybe do too many, which we don't want to allow because it looks like you're doing it for whole, right? For tomorrow, because you're doing so many. And it's also the utensil that's really generally used, like the sifter or the sieve or something that's specifically used for this purpose. Rabban Gamliel omer, af mediach v'sholeh. You can even fill up the bowl with water and remove the top layer, which is all the psolet, right? Because what will happen? All the chaff will rise to the top because it's very light. The grains will rise to the granules will sink to the bottom, and you remove the top off. Big debate. Is Rabban Gamliel more lenient than Beit Hillel or more stringent? So there's two ways to understand it. Either he's saying that mediach v'sholet is like using, because it's a typical way of doing it, it's like using a sifter or a sieve or the tavla, the large tablet. And then he's basically saying, not only can you use those, which Beis Hillel didn't think you could use, you can even also do this method. Or maybe he's being more stringent and saying you can't use the kanon or the tamchoy, any kind of thing that sifts in that kind of manner. You can only do it with the water. So there's a debate about whether he's more strict or more lenient than Beit Hillel. Tanya. So now we're going to quote a Beitzah dealing with Rabban Gamliel. Amar Rabban Gamliel. When can you do this with the water, right? Fill it up. Only if you have more food than chaff. But he says once you have more chaff than kernels, more husks, then everyone agrees that you have to take the food out and you can't remove the psolet. Okay? Says everyone agrees about that. Gemara now asks the question, and then wait a minute. There's a separate problem with what you just said. Yes, I understand you have to then take the food out of the psolet, but you have a separate problem, which is you can't even touch this mixture. Why? How could you even allow anyone to take the food out from the chaff, in that case, from the husks? Because this is a classic case of a mixture of two things. What happens when you have a mixture of two things? The majority kind of cancels out the minority, right? Regular laws of nullification, which means that if the majority of it is chaff, then basically you end up with just a pile of chaff. You don't even, the ochel, the food, becomes nullified to that, which means that it's muktzah. You have a separate problem. Forget borer. You can't even touch this. This is muktzah. So they say, lo tzricha, so it must be, it wasn't what he meant. He didn't really mean psolet merubah ochel. What he meant is, the nefesh betircha v'zutar b'shiur. Let's start with the end. Zutar b'shiur, really what he means is the psolet was actually less than the food. Okay, you had more kernels than husks. However, what he meant was, if it's more work to remove the psolet, then you have to do the ochel. If it's more work to remove the ochel, then you have to remove the psolet. In other words, it's a matter of which type of psolet is it and how hard is it to remove, and that will affect. It's a matter of not quantity, but almost quality, you would say, or how much work you have to do, and that will affect which direction you go. Now we're going to talk about this af mediach v'sholeh that he said, fill it up with water and skim off the top. So Rabban Gamliel omer af mediach v'sholeh Tanya, a Beitzah about this again. Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Tzadok. Kach haya minagan shel Beit Rabban Gamliel. This is what they would do at Rabban Gamliel's house. Shayu mevi'im dlim malei adashim umitzifin alav mayim. They would take a bowl full of a pail full of lentils, pour tons of water on it. Nimtza ochel lamata upsolet lamala. Right, again, you do this when you, right, this is again something you would see in the kitchen. You put your lentils into soak, and anything that's kind of, you end up with just a little of the peel of it, right? It floats right to the top because it's very light. But wait, there's a Beitzah that says specifically the opposite. You pour water on top, and the psolet's at the bottom, and the food is at the top. So how do we explain that? So again, this is something you'd see in your kitchen. Lo kashya haba afra haba gile. If you're talking about the husks, they rise to the top. But if you're talking about dirt, right, often mixed up in these are dirt because they come from the ground and they're full of dirt. When you wash, let's say, lettuce, and you put your lettuce in a bowl and you soak it, what happens? At the bottom of the bowl, you always see all the dirt. The dirt gets to the bottom, and the good stuff is at the top. So it depends what kind of psolet it is. If it's dirt, then it'll sink to the bottom, right? If it's the husks, they'll rise to the top. Okay, that's just basic knowledge. It's funny that the rabbis are discussing this. It could be they didn't really know because they weren't in the kitchen so much, and someone had to explain this to them because they weren't aware of, how exactly this works. Beit Shammai, or, alternatively, you could say they specifically knew, they were involved in it, and maybe, this is coming from knowledge. So it's two ways to look at it. Mishnah, Beit Shammai omrim, ein meshachim b'yom tov ela manot. You can only send gifts to people that are food. You can't send a gift like I want to send my friend a nice book or whatever it might be. Okay, from here you see that maybe there was this custom that people send gifts, and actually there's a source for it in Sefer Ezra where it talks about people sent mishloach manot. It sounds really like mishloach manot from Purim. They did it on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, then they sent these gifts to each other. So he says you can't do it on Yantif unless it's food, and we're going to see ready-made food. He thinks has to be ready to eat. Okay, which sounds a lot like mishloach manot, right? Some people say you have to send mishloach manot, things that are ready to eat. But here it's more of a Yantif issue because people aren't going to start preparing it on Yantif, and then it's going to be something they're not going to use on Yantif. So, why are you sending them it if they're not going to, if it's not ready to eat, that they could just eat right there? Beit Hillel omrim, mishalchim behema chayav va'ov ben chayim ben shchotim. You could send live animals because theoretically they could slaughter it. They might not, but theoretically they could. Mishalchim yenot shmanim uslatot v'kitniot. You could send wines and oils and solet, fine flour and kitniot and grain, legumes. You could send all those even if they're not cooked, okay? Because people can cook them. Avalot fu'ah, but not wheat. Because wheat, most people aren't going to use wheat kernels on Yantif because you'd have to, again, with wheat kernels, what do you have to do? You have to start crushing them in a machteshet, and you can't crush them in a machteshet because, right, what's the main use of grains? You're going to make flour out of them, and that you're not going to, people can't do on Yantif, so you shouldn't send grains. Rabbi Shimon matir b'tfuah, he even allows grains. Again, we have a Mishnah where there's Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, and then we have a third opinion. So he even matirs grains. Here you see he's clearly more lenient. So Tani Rav, we'll have to see why. First, Tani Rabbi Yechiel, the Mishnah discussed what can you send. Now we're going to discuss how can you send it. You can't have like an assembly line of people, like I'm sending with someone, he's sending with someone else. You can't get too many people involved because it becomes very public. And they think the public issue is a bit of an issue. Some people say it's because, Rashi says it's because it's going to look like shemolichim limkor b'shuk. Looks like you're doing business to sell in the shuk. Now, it's true we did say you could sell some things in the shuk, but a matter of how much business you can do and how, and it looks very business-like. It seems inappropriate for the holiday. Some people explain it in some other ways. What is a shura? No less than 3 people. In other words, you want to have a shura that's less than 3 people, which means that you can use 2 people, but not more than that. By Rav Ashi, classic Gemara question. Tzlata gavri, utzlata mine mai. What if you have 3 people, but you're sending 3 different items? So each person takes an item. Is that considered a shula and it's forbidden or not? Because each one only has, it's not like you're sending 1 item with 3 people. So Gemara answers, classic Gemara answer, teku, we don't really know. Rabbi Shimon matir b'tfuah. So now why? Tanya, Beitzah says, here we're going to see in a Beitzah what his reason is. Rabbi Shimon matir b'tfuah kigon chitim la'aso mehem ludiot. According to the Koran, this is some kind of cookies. In other words, you could use these grains in a particular type cookie that people would make on Yantif. Se'orim litain lifnei behemto, barley you would put before your animal. You wouldn't eat it yourself, but you would put before your animal. You feed your animal. Adashim la'aso mehem risisim. This was some crushed lentil dish that people would make. So there are uses of these according to Rabbi Shimon. Maybe they're atypical uses, but therefore he thinks it's okay. Other people think since they're atypical, no. Okay, next Mishnah, and there's a debate about this Mishnah. Is this? It doesn't say Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. Is it according to everybody, or is it just Beit Hillel? And it depends on what you think the issue is. So mishalchim kelim, you can send utensils, including clothing, bein tfulim, bein sheinam tfulim, whether they're sewn or not sewn. Even if they have shatnez in them, as long as you're using them for the holiday. Now, again, is this a carrying issue? If it's a carrying issue, then we already learned Beit Shammai only allows carrying for food. This is not for food. So then this would only be Beit Hillel. But if you say maybe it's an issue of it looks like something you would do on a weekday, then again, if it's for the holiday, we'll allow it, and then it's not a problem. As long as, right, if we don't think it's the carrying issue, but it's just can you send a gift without, let's say, carrying it through the public domain or something, then you would say maybe even Beit Shammai would agree. So, avalos sandala misumal, okay, but not a particular type of sandal. We're going to get into this tomorrow. It's a whole interesting story, and you can look at Shuli Mishkan's article this week on Flashback about, it has to do with Maaseh Shahayahu, about the Bar Kokhba revolt, and you can read more about the history of it, or wait till tomorrow's daf and then read Shuli's article where we'll get more into that. V'lo min al she'eno tafur, not a sandal that's not sewn. In other words, an unfinished product. Again, you have no use for it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af lo min al lavan, not even a white shoe. What's the problem with a white shoe, right? We wear white sandals or something, but what's the problem with a white shoe? Mipnei shetzarich uman. They did not wear white shoes. They only wore black shoes. If it wasn't colored yet, you need a professional to fix it. You won't fix it yourself on Yantif. So therefore, you can't send it on Yantif. Zakla, kosheno, timbo, b'yomtov, meshachinoto, anything you can use on Yantif, you can send, not otherwise. Bishlamat tfulim, so the Gemara says that we understand sewn clothes, chazun mabush, people wear them. She'ain tfulim nami chazil chasu. If it's not sewn, you can still use it as a blanket, cover yourself. But ela kilaim shatnes l'may chazu. Shatnes you're not allowed to wear, and you're not allowed to put on top of you. So maybe you could put it underneath you and sit on it. You could put it on a bench, let's say, and sit on it. The Hatanya, lo ya'ale alecha, it says, lo ya'ale alecha, which sounds like you can't put it on you, but it does sound like you could put it under you. And in fact, the Beitzah says, you can sit on it. But the rabbi said we can't do this because maybe a thread will get onto you and then you'll be over on the Doraita. You'll transgress the Doraita of not having mixed, right? This is, Shanes is mixed wool and linen. So, maybe you could say it's usable to sit on with something in between you and it. Let's say you have that down and then you have some cushion on top, and on top of that, right, maybe you're using that. But Ha'amar Rav Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rav Shimon ben Levi, we've gone back to this before. This is the Princess and the Pea story. Amar Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul, Amar Rabbi Mishum Kala Kadisha B'Yerushalayim. Okay, that's associated with two rabbis, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh and Rabbi Yossi ben Meshulam, who were either called the Kilak, the holy community of Jerusalem, either because they stayed in Jerusalem after the destruction when many people left the city, or because they split their day, a third davening, a third learning, and a third work, which shows that they valued work. And that was why they were called the sanctified community of Jerusalem. But anyway, what did they say? Afilu eser masaot zo agabe. So if you have 10 matzaot, 10 cushions, 10 mattresses, right? That's why I think of the Princess and the Pea, one on top of the other, and kilayim is underneath them, asur lishon alehen. You cannot sleep on that. Okay, even like Princess and the Pea, even if there's kilayim underneath all that, no can do. So what could the purpose of this kilayim be? What could you possibly use it for on Yantif? Ela bivilon, maybe as a curtain. That sounds good, but that doesn't work either. Hamar ula said mipnei ma'am vilon tamei. Vilon can be susceptible to impurity. Why? Mipnei shamash mitchamem kenegdo. Sometimes the guy who works in the house, the shamash, he might use it to warm up. If he's freezing and there's no blanket, he might use the curtain. So again, it's something you would put on you, which means it can't be made of shatnez. So I'm going to leave you today again with this question. Tomorrow's daf, we will get the answer to what on earth could you be doing with shatnez that one is allowed to send a cloth made of shatnez to a friend on Yom Tov. With that, we will finish for today. Have a great day, everyone.